Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for letting me take a week off. Hope and trust that your week was lovely. So here's where we left off, was on sort of some of the principal deities, right? And if I'm right, we haven't talked about Shiva yet, and that's kind of what I wanted to pick up at, because he's again, every village and possibly every household can have their own deity with a shrine, but there's sort of like these three principal deities that get called the Trimurti. So now down here we're at Shiva, and again, each aspect of the deity as imaged is revelatory about their inner character. So to be really clear, you look at Kali, and it's not, I probably said this last time, but it's not like people think, oh, she's got 12 arms, literally. It's to show like there is something superhuman, because we only have 2. So Kali can reach everywhere. Sort of like when we look at the Egyptian deities, where there's like the jackal head on a human body, they didn't really think of the deity like that. They're trying to say there's something superhuman. Right. So sometimes we look at images and say, oh, they took that literally. That's an idol. Their God looked like that. And no. That was meant to be a representation of something metaphysical. So down here is Shiva. And it's really important to notice this one, his hair, you can't quite tell. Maybe it's just long and loose, but it's supposed to be a disaster, like a real nasty hair. The one here on the bottom, stepping on the green guy.
Yeah.
Okay. So Shiva is the sustainer, but also the destroyer. So if you think about that, like in order to sustain life, when things die, like that has to go away. So if it makes sense, sometimes in Christian churches, you'll hear God, the creator, the sustainer, and the redeemer. So there's the creator, Brahma. Here's the sustainer, Shiva, and then there's Vishnu, the redeemer. If that makes sense, just typologically, that's a fair comparison. So Shiva's got some messy hair, and so do devotees of Shiva. And I can show you a picture of somebody like that in a second, who puts their hair purposefully in a top knot. This is like a way of devotion, is sort of looking a bit like Shiva. And there's this sort of ancient story about Shiva and what the knot sort of does. And it sort of goes that once upon a time, that there was a particular king who had quite a bit of hubris. This story is in the Mahabharata. And so he decreed that his horse was a holy horse, and he was going to set it free for a year, and wherever the horse touched will not belong to him. So the horse sort of goes around, and by decree, you can't really touch the animal. You can't harm it. Like, this is a thing. So sure enough, the horse disappears and chooses to go into the home of an ascetic holy man who just sort of sits and prays and meditates all the time. Well, the king had 10,000 sons. That's quite a few, isn't it? So the sons go looking, and they discover that the horse is sort of holed up in this man's home, and they go in with all of their weapons drawn because they're going to like sort of slay the infidel and free the holy horse. Meanwhile, the guy's just been sitting there meditating, so there's no foul play involved. So they go in and make this ruckus, and the holy man doesn't even move. He just opens his third eye, the one that is able to discern what's below everything going on, and it annihilates all 10,000 of them on the spot. They're just all dead. This is the power of the third eye. By the way, Shiva, you can see, has the third eye on his own head, right? It's drawn as this little line right here, and the third eye belongs to Shiva. So if you're a devotee to Shiva, you've got your third eye outlined, and you got the messy hair. So everybody's dead. This is a major problem because this is sort of like kings rule by, you know, some divine institution, and now all the heirs are dead. And there's only one solution, which is the river of life. The river of life is the holy river, the Ganga, which we usually call the Ganges, and it's in heaven, like way up top in the Himalayas. And so it's decided that they will share the river of life with the earth. This is how the Ganges comes to be. But if they let the water cascade straight to the earth, it would destroy the earth because it's so holy and powerful. So Shiva agrees to catch it in his hair. So the hair kind of buffers the falling of the river of life to earth and then allows it to flow. And sure enough, the 10,000 annihilated princelings are resuscitated. So, and then I think if I'm right, the king sort of repents from his hubris with the horse, and life goes on. And this is one story of many in the Mahabharata, which is about that thick. We'll talk about it in just a bit. Where does Shiva's third eye come from? Well, Shiva has a consort named Parvati who can also manifest as a cranky lady in Durga, who can also manifest as a really cranky lady in Kali. So she's like got three different wives, consorts, but they're really just one. Which is sort of interesting thing. And Shiva watches the world very, very carefully. And you have to imagine like the world's like this big compared to me, Shiva's size, right? All of this is not literal. It's just sort of an idea. I mean, we talk about this sort of business too in the church where we say like, well, God's got the world in God's hands, as if God had hands, right? But this is just sort of anthropic language. So Shiva's watching the world, and his consort Parvati is like, hey, why don't you look at me for a second? Like you're so preoccupied with taking care of all those people. Like, what about your consort? And Shiva's reply is like, no, like I've got, like you can have all of my other attention, but I've got to keep my eye on the world or there'll be a problem, right? And so sure enough, Parvati thinks it'll be really cute to prove her point that the world can go on without Shiva, and she sneaks up behind him and covers his eyes. Right when a serpent, you see that on his shoulder, comes to devour the planet, fortunately, Shiva, being all godlike and such, opens up his third eye, which enables him to see the danger and kind of like that holy man, eradicate the serpent with the power of the inner eye. By the way, we say things like third eye, but that's syncretism. That comes from Hinduism. In fact, if you look at our icon, station 13, many of the Greek Orthodox icons actually have an eye shape in the forehead. You may not realize this, but on further study, there's almost always an eye shape embedded in the forehead, revealing that saints have sort of this holy sight to them, and probably comes out of reaction to this. And we often say things like, look below the surface. Well, how can you do that? Not with these, but with this third eye, right? So you call it an EQ or whatever you want. But there's Shiva. It's funny in the slides, they both are Shiva and Vishnu look a little bluish, but Vishnu, you should know, should be bluer, because once upon a time some primordial beast was going to poison the world, and Vishnu drank it and saved the world, but became permanently blue from the poison. Now, why it is that children like blue slushies, I don't know, because they should be poisonous. Anyway. The other thing that Shiva is sort of not wearing is fine clothes. So Shiva is like John the Baptist. He's an ascetic. He sort of lives very coarsely and not finely, and he is trampling on one of those magical demons that tried to destroy the world. Where they come from, I mean, essentially nobody cares. We don't always have origin stories for our own bad people, but we realize badness exists and we have to deal with it. If I don't know if that makes any sense. You may be familiar with this other deity of luck, which is actually Shiva's son, Ganesha. He's there to the left. He's very easy to discern because he has the elephant head. And turns out Shiva, while being a sustainer, as I mentioned, is also a destroyer. And one time he was in a foul mood and cut his son's head off and threw it in a river. And his wife or consort was like, you got to fix this. And so what Shiva decided was to take the head of the next thing he encountered to give his son, a head, and it happened to be an elephant. So there it is. So Ganesha is like somewhat fixed from his father's ill mood. And I guess because he was lucky to get a head at all, he is now like the god of luck. So you will often see a shrine to Ganesha in Hindu-owned businesses. Whether that is like a convenience store or a dry cleaner or a restaurant, like you will often see that, because this is like courting the blessing of prosperity, if that makes sense.
Are those depictions of Shiva?
No, this is Shiva's third form of his consort Parvati, but in the form of Kali. So like if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, that's the goddess that Mula Ram like prays to, Kolima Shokdide, and he like pulls out people's hearts and burns them and does human sacrifice, and like it's just so overdone. Like again, if that's your impression of Hinduism, it's really sad. I mean, because like there's voodoo in the movie, and there's like heart removal, and ultimately like Indiana Jones is like this kind of agnostic or atheistic archaeologist, but like he stands and represents Shiva at the end, and the sacred stones start burning, and Mularam drops them in the ground. Does anybody remember this movie? It's sort of dreadful. It does turn out that Shiva has a sacred stone. It's called a linga, and it's not like pebbles as per the movie with diamonds in them that do magic things when you say Shiva. Instead of like a statuary, there's often this linga, which is sort of like capsule shaped with a pan around the bottom. And one of the ways you interact with the linga is to pour milk on it as a offering to Shiva. Sigmund Freud would say it's extremely phallic. Capsule shape that you pour milk on. I mean, it's about as phallic as you get. But that is a thing that you might have in a home temple, and that probably has something to do with fertility, because since Shiva is the sustainer, you need fertility.
In that same movie, he said you betrayed Shiva.
Yeah, that's right. You betrayed Shiva. You were focusing on Shiva's whatever consort, the destroyer, and not the sustenance aspect. And it turns out that Kali is not like Satan, but that destruction is a part of life, right? I mean, that's good thing we have things that help us compost when we die, right? Otherwise the world would be full of dead stuff. So there you go. That's really basic introduction. But those essentially are like the prime deities. Like I think if you were to say, do we have like a firm foundation out of a billion deities? There's some consensus that these are like the overarching ones, even though each home or each village may have a personal shrine. Is that helpful?
What's the relation of Hare Krishna?
Glad you asked. So Hare Krishna, right? So this is Vishnu, and Vishnu shows up in, and then this is actually a really great transition to the next slide. Vishnu shows up, he's going to show up 12 times in the end, but has shown up 11 times in human or animal form, like in physical form. So if you think about it, Vishnu is the sort of the redeemer, and Vishnu takes on physical form, and that's called an avatar. So forget James Cameron's movie, like an avatar is an embodiment of a deity. So it's a little different from Jesus. Like we say, oh, that's like Jesus. Well, the avatars of Krishna have magic powers, and they don't like die on a cross, to be really clear. So these avatars range from like a turtle, which again, what's the world resting on the back of a giant turtle? That was Krishna saving the world from getting thrown off into the oblivion, right? And one time Krishna shows up as Vishnu shows up as a boar. And the two that are probably most familiar would be Krishna as a human shows up in the form of this person called Rama. Hence, there's these scriptures called the Ramayana. And Vishnu shows up in a form called Krishna. So the Hare Krishnas focus their devotion on the avatar of Krishna. Now, that doesn't mean they exclude the other ones. This is what we'd call henotheism. Sure, there's all these other gods, but our devotion is toward this one. And if you've ever read the Bhagavad Gita, those are the scriptures about Krishna. So that story. The Bhagavad Gita is about this person who's a deity, Krishna, who's on the plains of battle, getting ready to fight a war against some members of their own family they've sort of had family conflict. There's rivalry for the throne. And there's this conversation that Krishna helps between his chariot partner about like, well, I don't want to kill my own family. That seems wrong. And Krishna says, but you have to do your dharma, your duty. So there's this conversation about getting somebody to do their proper dharma, even though it will cost them personally. And many people find this to be very, very inspiring. I mean, Gandhi did, for example. Has anybody read the Bhagavad Gita? It's not long. I mean, it's like 150 pages, I think. And it is like one of the most beloved little stories out of the Mahabharata. And you can download it or you can get a little copy of it. But again, it's about like the goodness of doing your duty. So Vishnu showed up and will show up one more time on a white horse, and that's going to be the end. Hey, what about the white horse? That shows up in, well, Jesus and Islam. And now we've got it in Hinduism, which means probably it came from here into the other ones. Does that make sense? By the way, if you've been to an Indian wedding, the groom typically rides on a white horse. There you go. Yeah. So all of these are like, what's interesting, right, is a lot of people have deep devotion, as I mentioned, to either Shiva or Vishnu because they're very active in sort of salvific events. And Shiva does represent this type of like wisdom that's more than meets the eye, right? And then Krishna, you've got all of these stories of deity who is personally involved in helping human affairs. So you get these like kind of like Jesus, right? So you like people have devotion to this particular deity, and the Hare Krishnas then focus on Krishna.
What is Harry?
I don't know. Maybe I used to know. Yeah. Any questions about the avatars?
Is it Buddha down there?
Yeah, that's Siddhartha.
Oh.
So it's interesting, right? Like, because Siddhartha Gautama comes from the Hindu tradition, and the Hindu tradition can also claim him if they want. Right? This is sort of an interesting bit, right? Again, when you're polytheist, there's always room for another one. The problem when you're monotheist is then there's no room for another one.
They claim that Buddha is an avatar of Vishnu?
Some people do, yeah. Some Hindus do. Not all people do, because the Buddhist teaching is actually really different from Hinduism, depending on what kind of Buddhist you are, right? Like if you're a Theravada Buddhist, you have no soul. There is no soul. The problem is you think there's a soul, and that's why you suffer. But in Hinduism, you do have a soul that gets reborn until it cleans all its karma. But if you're like a Mahayana Buddhist, then there's like bodhisattvas and like, which are like Buddhists who come back and are supernatural beings, like Tibetan Buddhists, like the Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of the Buddha who's here to like show you the way. Well, that sounds pretty supernatural.
Where do the Sikhs fit into this and the Jain?
So, okay, the Sikhs are probably a reaction against all of this. So the Sikhs really don't buy into any of this at all.
Okay.
but probably came from it, but reacted against it. The Jains are really a subset of Hindu, who are very, very focused on the way that you clean off your karma is through total nonviolence. And nonviolence doesn't just mean I don't hit you or assault you with my words. It means I don't hurt living things. So I'm only going to eat rotting vegetables that are dying anyway. I'm not going to ever eat meat because that came from inflicting pain. And that word is ahimsa, nonviolence, right? And I might even sweep when I go to make sure I don't step on a bug, right? And you know, like there's not a lot of Jains, you know, because we like eating food that's fresh, and Jains don't, right? And to think like about really being nonviolent at the deepest level, you're straining out your water so you don't drink microorganisms, but you're not putting chlorine in it, right? Because that would hurt them. So it's a tough lifestyle.
Yeah, we went to a Jain temple. It's kind of,
Yeah.
you could only go in. We could only go in to the, what would be the foyer, and we couldn't go any further.
Yeah, and so if you think about it, it's not like there's like, oh, there's Hindu and then there's Jains. It's that the Jains are a subset of Hinduism with a slightly different mindset about the kind of yoga you live into, and their yoga is ahimsa.
They're overlooking something major. Just by existing, humans as species, hundreds of other species have perished.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for us to critique it on the outside, because I would probably say that too. And I think that the Jain response is like, you know, that's just a flattening of our actual faith, right? Always easy to critique a worldview from the outside. But I just would like you to consider that, like, whether you identify as Christian or not, boy, it's easy to critique Christianity. And if you're an atheist, it's really easy to critique that. I mean, just honestly, like, there's no meta theory that doesn't have its own issues.
My girlfriend in college is named Jane.
Troublesome one.
J-I-N. I think she.
Jain? Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the scriptures. So as I mentioned to you, like the word, that word om means nothing, but it's the holiest sound that there is. And that's because there's a couple kind of categories of scripture. So the first is what's called shruti, which means things that have been heard. They've been heard directly from the deity. So when you think about inspiration, this is like a God talking in a human ear. Now, these are all in Sanskrit. And the only people who really can read Sanskrit are Brahmins. And it's a dead language. So it's not like they're talking to each other in Sanskrit. They're just reading these texts. Most Hindus couldn't care less about that because they can't read them. So this appeals, right, to one particular personality type that is now codified in a caste. The Brahmanas, the Samhitas, the Aranyakas, we'll talk about the hermit texts, the Upanishads. Like, those are like some of the more famous ones. What most people are interested in are what's called smrti. That means things remembered. So shruti, things heard, smrti, things remembered. And the biggest one, right, is the Mahabharata, which I mentioned is like really long. And if you like Bollywood, you can watch like episodes from the Mahabharata from Bollywood, like the Ramayana you can watch. There's even like compilations, like there's an Indian production company that's put on the whole Mahabharata, they think, but keep in mind, it's like really darn long, in like 40 episodes. And there's a lot of dynastic squabbles. Sounds no different from like Europe, but, you know, with some different tales and some divine intervention, just kind of like the Odyssey and Troy, right? Like if you've read the Odyssey and the Iliad, the recent movie with Brad Pitt, I guess it was like 15 years ago, does that gross injustice because it's saturated with gods conspiring and engineering events, and the Mahabharata is not necessarily any different from that. Again, the Bhagavad Gita shows up in there, and the Ramayana. These are very like These are very popular tales about different avatars of Vishnu. You'll also get to hear about the turtle and the boar and all of that. And a few of the stories I shared about Shiva's top knot and third eye and Ganesha being beheaded and giving the elephant head. That's the sort of bit you get in the Mahabharata. And so there is a fantastic element. They're narratives, so they're much easier to remember, right? I mean, we remember stories from Genesis probably much more fondly and accurately than we remember most of Leviticus. Because Leviticus is written for priests or folks who like rules. Now, those people love that. They don't love narratives that have like, you know, messy plots. They love that. And there are those people that exist. They work at NASA. So, right? I mean, we know that personality type well in this community, and we also know we love our stories, right? So here you get that there is like sort of something for everybody intentionally in Hinduism, and we have that in every faith. There is something for everybody, right? Laws of Manu is sort of like a tangential bit, and it is really like, what's the dharma of each caste? So it's not even really Shruti or Smrti. It's kind of like the Hadith. It's or the Apocrypha for us. It's like an appendix that's important, but it's not like on the level of Scripture. I hope that makes sense, the comparison.
Where Mike?
Yeah.
The Shruti. The God speaks to a guy, and then they write it down.
No, yeah, Shruti, yes, that's right. That's right.
Same thing with Moses.
Yeah, and
The
so
same thing with Muhammad.
except Muhammad couldn't write, peace be upon him.
Right.
So he recites it. And remember, when Moses gets the Torah, he gets two Torahs.
Right.
He gets the written Torah, and then he gets the oral Torah. So the written Torah is like Shruti, and the oral Torah is like Smrti. And like the Gospel of John says, there's so many stories about Jesus, I suppose if we wrote them all down, you'd fill the whole world with the volumes. But these were selected so that you can know salvation. There's Shruti, and Smrti are the ones that didn't get written down.
Could the Book of Mormon then be considered Shruti?
By a Mormon? Well, yeah, because it was written by, you know, the angel Moroni. Like it was written by a divine being. I mean, like as an Episcopalian, do I consider it Shruti or Smrti? No, it has no sacred value for me, but it does for them. So all of it's insular, right? Like I'm not rejecting the Book of Mormon, I'm just saying it's not in my canon of scriptures. And I haven't read it, so there. Okay. I don't know if I really want to talk about this. What I do want to talk about instead is that there's something interesting about audio therapy in Hinduism, if you didn't mind. So again, the word Om, it's heard, it doesn't mean anything, but because it's sort of a revelatory word from the divine, it does something to your being. And it's sort of interesting that like people find that word very centering. And I'm not like an audiologist, but I know one. And if I remember correctly, she says that there is something about that particular sound that lines up your throat and brain. It's sort of interesting. And I don't know if you realize this. I don't think I've got a slide on this one. There's this whole bit in Hinduism about chakras. Is this a new word? The chakras are energy centers, right? And each one actually has a different tone. So like if you went to a Hindu temple, or frankly, if you went to a store that is a purveyor of these items, there are these singing bowls, and they're actually tuned to be different. And I think there's 13 of them, and each one has a different tone, and each tone is associated with a different energy center, like your crown. There's a crown chakra. I actually have that singing bowl because my friend gave it to me. And like you can just ring it, and supposedly that sound does something that stimulates your cranium. There's some science behind it. I'm not going to call it soft science. I'm going to say there's some science behind it, right? So like audiologists are aware that there's particular tones that do stuff for you. In the Hindu tradition, these are associated with like parts of your Atman and energy levels, right? And sometimes if you get into a different healing tradition, they may say, well, like you've got a blockage in your crown chakra. That's why you're getting headaches, or that's why you're having writer's block. So the therapeutic intervention is that you sort of ring the singing bowl and you may sit it on your head and it'll just sit there and kind of resonate for like a minute or two. I had this one time where I had like 5 of these on me. This was from my friend, right? And they were ringing these singing bowls and they were putting them like on the places, and boy, I fell right asleep. It was great. I was a little embarrassed. I was like, boy, I'm getting this therapy and I'm just tired. So I fell asleep. Maybe that's what I needed.
The vibration is very calming.
It certainly can be. Now, if they're not in tune, the vibration's agitating, right? Like, so if they're not properly tuned, I don't know, like it's like nails on a chalkboard. You can actually find, it's an interesting thing that there's certain sounds that like release adrenaline and cortisol in our brain. Like that's just interesting.
And that's with the Om also, sound Om. You feel it, the vibrations in here and it calms the whole body.
Yeah.
For me, it does.
We don't, and I want to say, the whole music tradition of spirituality is lightly preserved in the West. We don't have Gregorian chant. We don't have it, but that may be like the closest thing we've got. We've got Anglican chant, which is not singing, it's chanting. So to be clear, I'm not a great singer. I don't even do great at the chant, but it's not a performance, it's a chant, right? And that way it's meant to be multisensory and different from just talking, because our brain does process musicality different than spoken language. I think that's no mystery. Like hopefully we all get that, right? But there are traditions in which singing becomes ecstatic. So you can really get you into mysticism in a jiffy. In fact, one of my friends from my Knowles trip is a conservative Jew who does mystical singing circles regularly. So he and his friends will gather together, sometimes marijuana's involved, and then they will just chant over and over and over again, particularly Hebraic prayers, which are tuned, right? Remember at your bar mitzvah, you don't read it, you do chant it, and has some kind of mystical experiences from that. I'm not going to call them invalid, and marijuana is not always involved, right? So that's an interesting bit. I don't know Christian folks who necessarily do mystical chant, although I would tell you, as a recovering evangelical, praise and worship music, which is highly, highly repetitive, and in no way is it harmonic, it's melodic, is sort of like a emotional release for a lot of folk. So much so that if you take a recovering evangelical and you put them in front of organ music, they're like, this is like nonsense. Because they haven't been trained to find this different interaction with, I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I was thinking about rosaries. When you pray a rosary, and growing up Catholic, and I felt and being amongst other Catholic children in school, chanting the rosary, and it's not chanting, it's praying.
Mhm.
But that is very, I think, calming and restful. And is it just the repetition? I don't know.
Oh, no, I actually do know. I actually do know that it has a lot to do with the repetition. And I'll just tell you as a swimmer, the first 4 laps, you're never in flow state because your body has enough natural energy to get you down the pool and back twice before you have to start tapping into your reserves. Like this is true of Olympians. So like you can get in the pool and swim 1, 2, 3, 4 lengths of the pool on what's in you right now, and then you have to tap into your reserves. So you cannot jump in the pool and be in flow state from the dive. You have to stick with it long enough and sort of accept it to get into flow, because part of the flow is whatever your breath pattern is, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, breathe. And that's all you can think about. And as the repetition goes, right, then you get into flow state, right? And so it takes the discipline of having done it enough for your muscular energy to be able to engage after 2 or 3 laps and enter into flow. And I don't think it's any different with the rosary or the Jesus prayer. Like, no Greek Orthodox person, the first time they pray, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, it doesn't work from the first go. It takes constant repetition and submersion until it becomes a neurological pattern in your brain that takes you to that flow state. I think that's fair to say. I don't know anybody who right at the beginning of a yoga, like a yoga class,
Right.
and they're like, get in sun salute, is like, I'm in flow now. Nope, you've got to enter into the flow. Just like the rosary, it takes a few repetitions to get you into the flow repetition.
Riding, I was a long distance cyclist. To me, riding a bike was for long distance.
If you stay on it long enough.
Yeah, you have to stay.
But
long.
right when you got on, you were
No,
not in the
no.
flow state, because your body doesn't even work that way,
No.
right? Your body, like a reptile, has quick bursts of energy, and then when it's gone, you have to have the slow twitch muscle fibers and like the metabolic system you've established to keep going and get into flow.
But after a while, you become part of, that sounds corny, but
Mm.
you feel like you become part of the bike.
It's not corny. Then
And
you
you
feel
are-
part of the pool when you swim long enough, right? Like, because you can't hold in your brain, like at the front, a really deep, like, inquisition. At the front of your brain is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, breathe. At the back of your brain is whatever you're thinking about and worried about. And that's the interesting thing, is the flow. By going into the necessity of breath, it starts to deregulate and re-regulate whatever it is you're thinking about. I hope I put that well. That's the neurologic research I'm familiar with anyway.
Well, everything has frequency, and they're doing a lot of healing now with frequency.
Yeah, my audiologist friend is a big believer in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, different. Well, I was reading that article on the insurance company down in Galveston, I guess that's the Moody Insurance Building, that's the tallest building down there. And all of a sudden, after all these years, it started cracking. And they couldn't figure out why. The foundation was proved out fine, but all the walls were cracking. They had changed the frequency on the yachts, or the coming in, the foghorns.
Yeah.
And
That's
once they
interesting.
figured that out, they changed the frequency again and it stopped cracking.
Yeah, and
So,
it's,
I mean, even though you don't see it,
yeah. Well, and it is very fair to say, from a physics point of view, you probably heard the old aphorism, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, did it make a sound? And of course, the answer is no, it didn't. It made vibrations, and our brain turns vibrations into sound for us. And for what it's worth, that's why these organ people are excited about a pipe organ. Because unlike a digital organ, it resonates and reverberates and vibrates, and speakers don't. They go doom, and it's done, because they have a buffer. And you may say, well, that's a lot of time and money for a thing to get some reverberation. I guess it is, but I think that's part of the difference between a real instrument and a digital one, is the reverberation and the frequency and the resonance.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that has the potential for an effect on us as we experience that vibration.
Yes, and I don't think that means a digital one's no good. I mean, actually, when you think about what an organ does, the organ doesn't exist on its own. The building is the organ. I know that's really weird to think about, but like, the building itself resonates with the sound, which is why we pulled the carpet. So that the building is part of the instrument. And if you've ever been in one of those old Gothic churches, or if you've been in a particularly well-built mosque, right? Like, you can just hear the echo and the resonance, and that was built on purpose, because I think we do have some sense that resonance does something to us that we don't even know how to quantify, so we call it spiritual. And I don't think that we're wrong. Like, it does something invisible to us, which gets measured in MRI machines, right? Like, it's sort of interesting bit. Yeah, so chakras. If you know anything about the Kabbalah also has energy centers, probably came from this. And your chakra is like your energy center, and we call it in Chinese. This comes from essentially Hinduism's push into China. We call it qi, right? That's sort of like your spiritual energy that you can harness. In Hebrew, it's called your nefesh, which is your soul, or your ruach, which again, Judaism is an Eastern religion, not a Western one, and therefore energy centers. And what do you know? Your soul in Judaism lives where your Atman lives, in your breath. We say in our heart because we're Westerners and we're silly. Anyway, yeah. Okay, so I don't want to talk about this other stuff. But the sound bit is interesting, and the ecstatic part of sound is also interesting. And if it's okay to mention before I get off of that topic completely, there is an interesting, you're probably aware that Johns Hopkins has done a study on psilocybins and their ability to be combined with like traditional therapy. Do you know about this?
No, what is psilocybin?
Psilocybins are like magic mushrooms, or like ketamine therapy, or even LSD. So there's been some push lately that these substances used in conjunction with qualified therapists are able to accomplish in weeks what often takes a decade or more, particularly with PTSD veterans. Now, this is not like Reed College in Oregon. This is Johns Hopkins, right? Which is kind of top of the poll, right? And in their published results, they found that they paired this with audiology. So there's a soundtrack to the Johns Hopkins psilocybin study, which is available if you're interested on Spotify. And there are many high pieces from Western tradition that show up, like cathedral style singing, high classical music. But there's also, this is very interesting, and keep in mind, most of these veterans aren't Hindu. There is like a particular song that is on devotion to Shiva. It's called Om Namah Shivaya. I just play a little. Have you heard it before? Do you know it?
Yeah, we used to check this.
So you can hear the circularity. It goes on for about 20 minutes. And it's got slight variations, but it's got a lot of rhythm and drumming on something called the tabla, which are like tuned drums. You can hear the of the sitar, right? And some traditional Hindu instruments. But actually, if you listen to the whole track, it's minorly mesmerizing in a disaffected state. And curiously enough, what psilocybins tend to do to men more so than women is enhance audio effect, per the Johns Hopkins study. So apparently, many men under the influence of psilocybins, it's like the music is inside their soul, not from a speaker, like they're in the music. It's interesting that that has therapeutic value from people who have PTSD.
Didn't the Beatles get into some of that?
They did. And sure enough, when they had a spiritual transformation, they started writing songs that made no sense whatsoever. Like We All Live in a Yellow Submarine. Go figure that out. Right. But they sure enough, they had interaction with parts of Hindu tradition and had some spiritual transformations. And then it's really weird. And if you play the music backwards, it sounds like Satan's commanding you to eat your children, apparently. Yeah, I didn't know about that, but sure. A couple of the Beatles did. If you're interested, I'm not advocating psilocybins, and I certainly wouldn't advocate it unless you were in a study group with somebody who was qualified to do that work with you, right? Because like that, it can go really poorly. Like there's research that says if you've got latent schizophrenia, psilocybins can turn it right on, and it doesn't turn off. So like that's a risk. But the Johns Hopkins playlist is interesting to hear what music researchers selected to pair with essentially a psychedelic experience that's supposed to be therapeutic.
So this Sunday, the choir singing Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
You won't find that in the playlist. No, because they're very aware that popular music actually isn't appropriately stimulating, and it isn't.
Well, they said a lot of times the tuning of, that they tune now is, have they changed the frequency that they tune to? I think that changed in like the 30s and 40s, and it's, if you go back to the old ones, it's much more soothing.
Well, it's interesting. I would tell you that most popular music on a guitar can be played with 3 chords. So there's very little variation.
Mm.
And there's very little complexity. Part of why I think they might have included this particular version is not only because it goes in loops and circles with minor variations, and it does crescendo and comes down and sort of does this, is that the sort of the Western musical scale is different from the Eastern scale. So, and if you know anything about traditional Jewish music, like if you've listened to Fiddler on the Roof, it sounds to us like it's in a minor key. That's because it's tuned differently. So in order to help stimulate different parts of the brain or the soul, whichever you're inclined to say, there's this inclusion of different musical scales. Yeah, and so it is very possible that you could go into a Hindu temple, or you could meet somebody who practices their Hinduism through this rising chant modality. I don't know if that makes sense. Again, we don't do that as much in the West in Christian form. We just don't. But it is a part of other major world religions. Maybe I belabored that too much. I hope I didn't make a mess of all that.
You know, there's an opposite to Om. It's the most annoying sound in the world, Dumb and Dumber.
Oh, yeah, fair. Right. There are some pretty grating sounds on the human ear. Okay. Any questions about musicality? Here are just some basic little symbols. And puja means worship, and you often can worship if you want to at a home shrine. So you don't have to go to a temple, which is called a mandir in Hindi. Although if you wanted to go to the closest mandir, I think it's in Pearland.
Yes.
And you'll see some of these items at the Pearland Temple, right? So bell, once again, bells are tuned, and you'll meet people who will tell you different things about bells, right? Like I've seen, and maybe this actually still works. Let me see if this will play. It may not. I hope it will. It's not, I don't know, it's not participating. Okay. You can look at YouTube videos of like swamis explaining all of this business, but there's some ideas that bells drive down evil spirits. Or once again, that bells or singing bowls can stimulate your chakral center, right? And so temples, mandirs tend to have those. Ash is an interesting bit, and you see our Shivite down here. There's his third eye. His hair is a bit of a mess, and he's pretty darn dirty, right? Like Shiva's a pretty dirty guy. You know, ashes, we use them on Ash Wednesday, right? It's a sign of not only repentance, but it's a sign of memento mori, right? Like you're going to die. And ash is related to, of course, reincarnation. And many of you probably know that even though it is chemically among the filthiest water in the world, the Ganga is the holiest, purest water in the world. So I don't know if you know that a few years ago, like 3, some guy got in Galveston Bay, having had a tattoo a week prior, and got flesh-eating bacteria that ate his brain and killed him, right? Because he had like a minor wound. So Galveston Bay, not the cleanest. Well, you know, the Ganges is probably significantly grosser than that. But people bathe in it regularly because with your third eye, it's the river of life that falls from heaven. And you probably know that in Hindu tradition, there is some kind of prosperity that comes from having your corpse or your cremated remains thrown in the Ganga. Like it can cleanse off some of your karma. Some traditions might say it washes it all away. So if you can get your body or your cremains, and there are these ghats all along Varanasi, Benares, which is like the landing place, where people get cremated and they just throw that stuff right in the river. And then you see like other people like getting down in the river. I'd get in it. My wife says I'm crazy, but I would. You know, maybe you could do something great for me. Who knows?
We saw, I got pictures of a dead cow floating in the Gandhi.
And you'd get right in next to that dead cow and wouldn't look at it twice. And in fact, you might say a dead cow, like that's a higher incarnation than me, so I want to be around it. And you may say, oh, that's non-scientific. Look, we do non-scientific stuff all the time, right? Like we are like emotional people that think we're scientific. Let's just be honest, right? Otherwise, none of us would drive a car. All right. Again, holy water exists. Like they've got it. I mean, I'm not sure that it's much different from how we use it. You're probably very aware of incense, and hey, aromatherapy has like hit the US in the last 15 years, thanks to Scentsy. But you know, aromatherapy's been around for a long time, right? And sure enough, there's different blends that actually do very different things to your brain. And in the Hebrew Bible, there's a particular incense that you only use for the temple. And if you make it for some other reason, you die because it's sacrilege. Like there's holy smells and there's regular smells. The 5-wick candle, I mean, kind of so what? It's the 4 cardinal directions plus like the center of directionality. And then I'll talk about the Bijan later, and then sure, Amandir's a temple, but you don't have to go to one. Many folks have, again, a shrine in their home, and look, there's Ganesha on a bell that you could use at home, but you might also have like essentially a statuary of Ganesha or Krishna or a deluxe painting that is at your home sanctuary. Sometimes you might make food offerings, right, where you'll put them out. And do they disappear? I don't know, but it's clear that the gods, being immaterial, don't need food stuffs. They eat the essence of the food. Because everything has like an accident, like a material form, and an essence. And by the way, Aristotle said that too, right? That's where transubstantiation comes from in the Catholic Church, that the material form doesn't change, but the essence does. So it doesn't taste like blood, but it has become blood. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm going to show you another Shivite here. Oops, I went too fast. No, I didn't. Okay. Yep, there's our, go back. Here's our Shivite, right? Couple of symbols. You're probably familiar with Om, and you can dress it up and put it in a lovely flower, often a lotus flower, which, what do you know, symbolically, it is like a beautiful flower that grows on muck, right? So it rises out of Maya or illusion and becomes beautiful, just like the transmigration of souls is meant to kind of take you up. The swastika is a Hindu symbol representing the 4 cardinal points of life. Now, I've heard people say, well, if you turn it, like if you invert it, that's what the Nazis used. I don't even know all about that. Again, what's interesting is it's a really old symbol about cardinality and sort of universalism. We know it from the Third Reich, and as I mentioned, this still shows up in India. It's not like Indians are afraid of Hitler, frankly, appropriating one of their own symbols. They're not concerned by that. It is, as I mentioned to you, ironic that Hitler claimed to be from the dominant Aryan race, who was a dark-skinned, illiterate people. So there you go. And then you're probably familiar with the bindi, which our lady friend down here is wearing on her forehead, and that signifies she's a married woman. It's not a tattoo, it gets reapplied. Could be henna, so that you don't have to reapply it every day. But in general, it's red. And if you're a widow, it might be black. Now, 150 years ago, if you were a widow, you got burned alive on your husband's funeral pyre, so you were black. But since
Well-
Gandhi has outlawed that practice, it still happens in India, but it's illegal. It doesn't happen often. Now the widow may take the black. You probably know that in general, women wear saris, right? Which is wrapped and kind of looks like a kilt, but with fine fabric. So our friends wearing that, and also you see the nose jewelry, which the Bedouin also wear. Remember, Eastern religion. So if you think through when Abraham sends his slave to find a wife for the child Isaac, the slave meets Rebecca, and Rebecca's willing to be married, and immediately the slave puts a ring not on her finger but in her nose. So that's an old symbol also of betrothal. Did Rebecca get a bindi? I doubt it, but in the Bedouin culture today too, if a woman's betrothed or married, she gets a nose ring, not a finger ring, or both. But this is the older wedding ring, it's through the nose. Okay, a few more symbols that you may see. And sure enough, the Star of David shows up as well. They don't call it the Star of David, but I don't really know what to say other than here are some. So the bindi, right, as I mentioned, is the dot on the right, and that's on the lady's head, and there you see Om. There you see the swastika. The trident shows up quite a bit for the Trimurti, right, the three deities of Brahma and Krishna, Vishnu and Shiva. If you've been to yoga, you know Namaste, which means something like the sacred in me salutes the sacred in you, right? And is this where we got praying hands from in the West? I don't know, because as a little kid in the Baptist church, it was like, we're all going to pray, so hands together and heads down, which is actually what you do when you see someone and say, Namaste. So maybe we're recognizing the sacred in God the way that Hindus recognize it in one another. Okay, oil lamps, fine, we use that. The Kundalini are the twin serpents. I mean, look, I don't need to talk through all of these, but there are some you may see. The mudras are interesting down here on the bottom left. These are postures for you. This isn't the only one. If you've ever looked at statues of the Buddha didn't look like that statue. Each part of the statue represents a quality of virtue that the Buddha embodies. And the Buddha has different mudras depending on the statue because each one means something different. Since we talked about the Enneagram, the speaker who came to us identified for each of the 9 Enneagram locations, there's a different mudra. And honestly, some people have a hard time letting go. So there's a mudra for those folks. When you pray, you put your hands in the I'm letting go. There's people who have a hard time accepting themselves. Here's their mudra when they pray. I hope that makes sense. It turns out that this one's interesting because I had a Hindu friend who told me that Hindu dance is also very different from Western dance, not just footwork, but there's a lot of hand positions in Hindu dance. And so there's a different dexterity required to make these mudras quickly and on command. Like if you wanted to just bend this one finger and have it be very straight, I don't know how to do that because I haven't apprenticed to do it. I can kind of do that one, but it's really difficult to do that with my pinky without moving this. So these are the sorts of bits. It's like, how do you move fingers and see, like this one's not even straight now. I can bend it, but it's like bent at this joint too. So this is like a kind of practice because the hand position corresponds to a way of prayer. So talk about multisensory, right? Smells, bells, right? Even better than we do it in a high Anglo-Catholic church, right? That's part of what you'll see. And sure enough, there's chakras, which what do you know? They're kind of shaped like your vertebrae, and that's where they line up anyway. I'm no expert on Hindu symbols, but just a few to throw out there.
I went to U of A.
Oh, that's what it is. Okay, okay. Yeah, I mean, I only know a few and they're not necessarily like great outside of gangs. So anyway. Pilgrimage is part of Hinduism as well, like it is in every world religion, right? So consider our Jewish brothers and sisters go on pilgrimage, so much so that if you're Jewish, you have something called a birthright, or the Jewish Foundation will pay for you to go to Israel. And if you're Christian, like we do this, like we do, and Muslims do it, and probably Hindus did it first. And there you see Benares, the holy city, which is called Varanasi or Benares, like the B and the V actually are the same letter. And there's boats on it, and as I mentioned, there's pyres all along the river where people get cremated, and then the ashes get sort of dumped. Burial of human beings is really old. And some people actually think that the word humare in Latin, from which we get the word human, is related to burying their dead. I've heard that theory espoused. But Hindu folks have been doing cremation for a long time. And now we do it in the West too, because it's cheaper and ecologically sensitive. So you're gonna be reborn anyway, and your Atman is not bound essentially in your flesh, like it's going to take on new flesh. So it's not like you're desecrating your soul. In fact, you're sort of helping it along, right? So Benares is the holy city, and you guys have been.
Yes, yes.
Has anybody else you've been to Benares? What'd you think?
It's mind-boggling. Yeah, there's just so much activity, and there's so much devotion, and there's so much film.
And it stinks, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Yeah.
I spent like 10 days in India, and
Okay.
Benares is one of the places.
And similar for you guys?
Yeah, I went on a boat
Uh,
out there to see, to see the pirates.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating experience, but what was interesting, as I was going down to get on the boat, I was going through a very small alley. And I was coming that way, and there was a cow coming that way, and I had to get out of the way.
You always yield right away to a
And-
cow. It's bigger than you and it's holy.
Yeah.
It didn't become like a Pamplona thing. It didn't chase you
No,
with
no,
it. Okay.
no, yeah, no. I got out of its way.
Did you get in the water
No. No.
because it's dirty or because it's not your tradition? I'm always curious.
Well, there was no opportunity.
Yeah,
For us, there was no opportunity.
If you run a tour,
Oh, well, no, we were on tour. We had a guide, but no tour.
because there are steps.
mhm.
There's a portion of steps where you can like wade in. And some people submerge themselves like daily. So similar to baptism, the idea is washing off the bad bits.
And you could see people from the little boat I was on.
Waiting and
Yeah,
maybe ritually immersing themselves,
and
yeah.
also they were doing their laundry too.
There's a lot of things happen in that river. That's what happens when you pack 1 billion people into Texas. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? 1/8 of the world in this state. Yeah,
It was a fascinating experience being in it. And we just really, we had a couple of guides,
A guide
we had a guide
and a driver.
and a driver.
yeah.
So, they pretty much did what we wanted, wherever we wanted to go or what we were asking about. They were very open to telling us as whatever it is that we were asking about. With nothing was a secret or anything like that. We got stopped. Remember the guys, because they thought they didn't, some men stopped us. And the driver, it's like, these are visitors, these are guests, they're guests, they kept referring to us as guests, they're guests, they're guests. That was kind of frightening for a little bit. I'm still not sure what it was that happened. We were in the South.
Hmm.
And I remember that, and that was kind of scary, but, and the driver kept saying they're guests, they're guests, they're guests, and they didn't ask us to get out of the car.
Invoking hospitality, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. It is interesting. Maybe I'm a little bit of a voyeur, but there's something compelling to me about observing people in their piety. Which is what you'd see at Benares. Like, you may say that's super nuts, like I would never do that, but to like see people authentically engage is, I actually find that to be a little transcendent.
It's very inspiring.
Even if it's not your own tradition and you would never do it, to watch other people like be transfixed in their own acts of piety is to me very compelling or inspiring. Yeah. We went to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 2017, which is supposedly where Jesus was crucified and entombed. And there's a slab that theoretically is where his dead body was laid before he got put in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. And I'm always like, well, how do you know you got the right one? Whatever. Okay, so I'm there, like real skeptical as a Westerner. And there were these like ladies from probably former Soviet Union who they look like babushka dolls, who were like anointing the slab with oil and rubbing it in, and they were weeping. And they weren't putting like this was like this. It was really weird because in the middle of my skepticism, I was like, here was this other human being, like utterly transfixed and anointing this stone with some oil that could have come from like Vladivostok or, St. Petersburg, I don't know, and just crying. I was.
And for me, it invokes a yearning to feel that
Connection with the transcendent.
connection,
Yeah.
devotion, connection with the divine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I want to feel that.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't do it for me.
Right.
And I'm not real sure what would.
Yeah. If they let me go, I'd be on the Hajj tomorrow. Not because I believe it, just because if you're a Muslim, that's the most moving thing you're going to do in your life. And to be with 1 million people doing that in synchronicity, there's just something I'm really curious about that.
When you were there that year, what event did you miss? Us winning the World Series or getting the worst flood in our history?
When,
2017, right?
no, we didn't miss anything. Was that Harvey, 2017?
Yeah, the first World Series.
We went in March. So we were here for both. Yeah, I don't miss any of the fun. I just add to it. There's a site called Vrindavan, which is like the birthplace of Krishna as an avatar, but you have to hold that word birth like really lightly, because he wasn't born like Jesus from the Virgin Mary. He's like a superhuman individual. In fact, like you'll hear when we talk about Buddhism, that there's variant strands, like the Buddha is born to a regular woman, or like the Buddha was born from an elephant. Like it just sort of depends. And those actually, that sounds like those are two different stories. They may not be different at all. It may be that the elephant is like a way of understanding the inner essence of the Buddha's mother, so you can hold on something so tight it becomes fantastic, or you can say there's something being represented here that I don't get at surface look, right? But anyway, you can go to Vrindavan, there you go. Boy, I'm blanking on Jagannath Puri. Rameshwara would be like the place associated with Rama. So in the Ramayana, this is a Hindu epic, Rama is supposed to marry this particular princess, and that's the fate of the world. And then the reigning king says, no, you can't, and you're in exile. And Rama obeys his dharma. He's not the king, so he goes and lives in the jungle. And then some kind of demon steals his intended bride, and Rama recruits a monkey man, and they fight it out. And if you watch a Bollywood movie, there's a lot of dancing in the middle of these fight scenes, and then they get back onto the fight, and sort of Rama saves her from the demon, they get married, and Rama becomes a king until he disappears. And so that's part of the Ramayana for you, right? And you can go to Rameshwara, which is on the edge of this big forest where Rama spends time in exile, because you do your duty even if you don't deserve to. So you can make pilgrimage there.
It was very cold when we were, where was it?
We went to Darjeeling.
We went to Darjeeling.
Darjeeling, yeah.
Up in the Himalayas.
Up in the Himalayas.
Yeah.
But it was, amazing. We were in this tiny little room and then when the guy brought you bucket of cold, we better go here. I know.
You're okay. No, you're okay. I mean, actually, like, what's interesting is like, just keep in mind, it's why Hinduisms is really important. It's not like a monolithic expression of a polytheistic religion that a billion people belong to. I mean, even Islam has variations, arguably many fewer, but like, like if you go up into Tibet, you'll see these like rolling, they're not bells, they're like prayer wheels. But that's not unique to Buddhism. Like you'll find that in Hindu mandirs as well, right? This idea that you roll this thing and it's like a prayer that continues to go as the wheel goes, right? I mean, again, you'll see those a lot in Tibet, but you'll see them in India too. Prayer flags, you'll see those in Tibet, but you see them in India too, because anytime the wind, the Atman, the moving air, blows it, then it's like a prayer being activated, right? Candles and prayer, we use them in church, they do too, right? It's sort of represents your prayer for you while you're not thinking about it, right? Like these are things that happen according to different regions. But because people move, they bring their practices with them and you get all of this sort of intermixed stuff. We'll just talk about a few holidays. No, but let's wait till next time. Yeah, because we're really close here. So next time we can talk about holidays. Now it is Holy Week next week, but I'll still be here at 10 o'clock if you'd like. And we'll probably mostly wrap up on Hinduism next week, because to be honest, even though it's so big, I just haven't read as many of the sacred texts as I have of the other ones. But I hope I'm giving you an okay introduction. Any questions I can work on between now and then, or thoughts for the day?
Well, yeah, I was kind of interested. I know that the Hindus don't like the Muslims. But there's also a group in there called Parsi, Parsi.
Yeah, and the Parsi are really Zoroastrians, right? Because the Parsi that's where the word Persian comes from. And the religion of Persia was Zoroastrian. And by the way, there are more Zoroastrians in India than there are in Iran.
And they're wealthy.
Yeah, and they do some really interesting things. Like when you die, they put your dead corpse on top of a tower for vultures to eat. And there are common complaints in India of vultures like dropping body parts in random fields.
Yeah, we saw
We
that.
saw that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but what the Zoroastrians are doing, right, is returning you back to the ground, right, more quickly. I mean, they don't do it with cremation. They do it this other way. You're actually nourishing an animal.
Yeah.
As you know, when you cremate, nothing gets nothing. I mean, no animal gets anything out of that. Yeah.
That was kind of weird.
I don't think I would want to, like, just be walking out in the house and some bird drops like a semi-bloodied femur, like that's a little socially disturbing. Because we're just not used to it. But there are complaints about that in India today. Yeah.
Like pet therapy at nursing homes, instead of a golden retriever, a vulture at the foot of your bed.
They don't pet them. No. The vulture is not your friend. It's just like involved in doing this other bit. Yeah. Yeah. And contrary to popular belief, I mean, I'm not an expert on Zoroastrianism because nobody is. I mean, most of the practices got burned up when Alexander took over Persia, honestly. But you see these awful depictions in movies about this dualism, but like good versus evil, yin and yang. That's not a Zoroastrian idea. Evil loses. Zoroastrianism, monotheism.
Oh, it's interesting that Hindus don't do anything with the Parsis. They're because the biggest companies over there are owned by the Parsis.
But let's consider why that is. If you're polytheist, there's always room for somebody else. If you're monotheist, there's no room for anybody else. So the question is, do Hindus dislike Muslims, or do Muslims refuse to do anything with Hindus? And over time, that has rebounded. Same thing with Zoroastrians. When you're monotheist, that other stuff is not something you tolerate, it's wrong. So I'm gonna have nothing to do with you. Well, fine, like if you hate me, then I'll hate you back. Like you just, like. And there's obviously a history of politics involved, right? And part of the Hindu-Muslim tension had to do with the foundation of Pakistan, in which it was just arbitrarily decided this is Muslim, this is Hindu. And there were all these Muslim people living in India and all these Hindu people living in Pakistan, and they had to leave or die. Not because the government would kill them, but because it wasn't safe, given the history of aggression between the two. I mean, when India was formed, they didn't want Pakistan.
When I was in India, we also went to the Kashmir, which was Muslim. And there was fighting and the boundaries kept moving back and forth. So there were times where we could hear gunshots.
Which side did you fight for?
I did.
And join in the
Very
fray?
peaceful.
Not that time.
And you mentioned Sikhs earlier, didn't they try to bridge the gap between Hindu and Muslim, and they got the crap kicked out of like both?
We'll talk about Sikhs later. Now, again, I'm no expert on Sikhs. I'm not, but it's a Sikh in general. If they're wearing a turban, men have to have long hair, and it gets wrapped up.
Curved blade.
They have to have a curved blade with them all the time, even though they're not prone to violence. That's a sort of a sacred knife, not a weapon. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Namaste.
Stay.
My uncle